I'm also sort of in I think, a slightly weird position. Deborah and other people, Art certainly has been major in the parent-child centers and looking at family engagement. It's a very important part of what Deborah laid out. It's like, in many things, a thin veneer on many things. And now I get to try to bring some of that together. So I'm going to do my best. And my goal is really to provoke a more sustained conversation. Craig Ramey said he'd like to have 10 days someplace to drill deeper. My goal would be that at least one of those days is looking at family engagement, and that in each of the successive days, it's a piece of the conversation. So for me, if this were successful, that would be part of what happens. So let me get this. So I want to say a few things just to sort of introduce myself. Like Art Rolnick, and I suspect, looking around the room, a number of other people in this room, certainly the Rameys and other people from whom Deborah Stipek, other people from whom I've learned a lot over the years about early childhood and family engagement. I'm in my 4th decade of doing it. And I think, like all of us, we began this work in the prenatal period, our prenatal period, and you need to understand that. I also began in the 1960s during the War on Poverty, when Head Start was getting going. I had the benefit of being at Harvard at a time people were looking at equal educational opportunity, then to go and work for Uri Bronfenbrenner and do a postdoc with Ed Ziegler, and then make a commitment to trying to look at the family slice of early childhood and of kids, educational equity subsequently. So I kind of bring that to the table. I also was helping to develop the new Head Start, not so new anymore, but new Head Start family and community engagement framework, and have recently had the opportunity to look at some of the things that are going on in exactly this space, the family engagement and early childhood space, in a number of developing countries. So I'm going to really use this as a chance to try to create a conversation, make some observations, share some of what we've been doing, and then really try to stimulate more attention to this part of, I think, the work. So I argue family engagement is a public good, and I can tell you from having looked at sort of efforts to engage families from the Puritan period on, when they did invest as communities, sometimes from a religious framework, there was a big investment in parenting and trying to ensure that parents were conveying the values, et cetera, et cetera. So for a long time in this country, even though we've been contesting whether or not we should be involved in supporting parenting, we have a very long history of trying to do it, which I think is important in this. And we've been willing to say, from a collective community perspective, and I think increasingly, and certainly from Head Start on, that it reflects a public good that's worth investing in. That what families do in terms of supporting their kids' learning and development is an important public good. And I see, if some of you may have looked at the recent spring report from the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank, looking at their investments in early childhood. If you take a look at that, they talk about the need to now begin to look at family learning, family engagement, parenting education, that nested set of things as part of efforts to build strong early childhood systems more globally. So we're going to see, I think, real efforts now to build this into a more global conversation, and I think we have opportunities to learn from developing countries some things that may help us in our own space. So I want to situate us also in family engagement as a vital and innovative space, and I want to share just some pictures here. So picture a Head Start classroom where there's a parent and a teacher sitting there looking at data on the child's performance, and the teacher and the parent having a conversation that is accessible, comprehensible, and actionable, so that the parent is learning things he or she or grandma or uncle can do at home to support that kid's development, and that's happening on a regular basis. That's a key part of what we're trying to bring into Head Start at this point, is actual, not just use of data to look at center performance, but also sharing it with ways that are comprehensible and actionable for parents. So that's one vision to have. A second is a parent and a child, an immigrant, not immigrant, but a low literacy migrant worker in Maine, part of a program that's working with families and kids with an iPad. And many of the parents are not bilingual and not literate in their own language, but they're using iPads to tell stories and begin to develop literacy skills. That program then built a connection with a library in a small community, and that library has begun to do very different programming that attracts those families in for story hour and other kinds of things. Third example is Massachusetts. You go on the MTA, and there are placards now where there's usually advertisements for healthcare that are brain-building things that you can do with your child. That's part of the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge Award, where they partnered with a whole bunch of different not usual suspects, including the Mass Bay Transportation Authority, to get parenting messages for things you can literally do while you're sitting there riding to your destination. That's another example. In Chile, they have now a program that's around the transition to school in the early grades that's building in family engagement and specific things families can do to support their kids' learning and development, targeted to those kinds of activities. It's being evaluated by the Poverty Action Lab at MIT with a random control study. The early findings of that are changes in parenting behavior and some numeracy and literacy gains for kids. Finally, Pittsburgh, where the people at Carnegie Mellon have developed a program called Message from Me, so that every day parents are getting from their kids, an early childhood program, photographs and artifacts and things by email and cell phone and the rest of it about what I did at school today, that then creates a conversation and begins to build some of the things the parent can do at home to support that kid's development. Brazil. I was just there recently, and I was talking to people who are funding a program in the north, in the Amazon, in very poor communities. Actually, they're serving about 500,000 people now. It's literally people sit outside in the evening, because they're all working during the day, the kids and the families, for a video thing on matched to the country's education standards, how kids can learn and what they need to be learning. And it's literally a set of distance learning lessons. What they didn't anticipate, they hoped that the kids would all be there. What they didn't anticipate was how many of the families and siblings were there. And they're now looking at that as an opportunity to begin to do some things that families can do to support the kids' learning and development. So this is the face, I think, of innovation, allowed or enabled sometimes by digital media, sometimes by other things, that is intentionally directed to trying to support families in efforts to build their children's learning and development, and bring in a bunch of different community organizations, libraries, museums, church-based groups, et cetera, in a common effort to try to reinforce the importance of family engagement and provide real opportunities to engage in their various spaces in order to boost the kids' learning and development. So I would argue we've got real potential innovation out there. Whether we go from we've got a lot of stuff we can do, or nothing else is working, so we might as well try family engagement perspective. I think the challenge is to build the policies, the practices, the research, the evaluation capacity that really does have a good promise of strengthening and sustaining family and community engagement in early childhood and beyond. So again, this notion of you're not just doing it for the early years, you're building for continuity and building family engagement pathways. Then I would argue early childhood is a perfect place to begin to build those pathways. And then you are determining, testing, is family and community engagement a powerful contributor to achieve education equity? So I think that's the challenge that the field faces at this point. And my ask, if you will, in this, is that all of you engage in that conversation and take on this challenge. So I mentioned Head Start. That sort of put the imprint of family engagement back in the 1960s, mid-60s, on the importance of family engagement. And I think we have that legacy, we have that imprint, we have a lot of lessons to be learned collectively from all the Head Start centers, but also from individual ones about family engagement and how to do it, family and community engagement and how to do it effectively. We have the Perry Preschool Project. Larry Schweinart's here. When I started the Harvard Family Research Project, we combed every single piece of evidence we could on family engagement in early childhood. Preschool project was one of the most important ones. And what I noted was, as it progressed and I think transformed our understanding of what we ought to measure and all the rest of it, the once a week home visit fell out of the discourse. At the same time, you had something that we talked about earlier, which is the Consortium for Longitudinal Studies with Irving Lazar, and this set up 11 programs, some of which were home visit based, some of which were home visit and classroom or classroom based, that were beginning to generate evidence that suggested the importance of the value added of the family piece of it. You also had in the mid 60s Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who wrote an article, and I think we talked about it earlier this morning, that said his bet was that if you did interventions that were not just a classroom, but also a classroom plus a family, your chance of sustaining the benefits was substantially higher. And I don't think we have robustly tested that to the extent we need to. Certainly Art's work is contributing to that conversation. But in the spirit of some of the discussion this morning, we don't have clear definitions of what family engagement is. We have a whole set of issues if we're going to get serious about measuring the value added, if you will, of family engagement. The most robust data we've got, and there's a nice paper by Lindsay Chase Lansdale and Jean Brooke Gunn looking at 2 generational programs that also makes this point. We've got a lot of evidence from 40 years of developmental research that suggests, whether you're using a proximal framework, a continuity and change framework, or a risk and resilience framework, that when you can intervene in 2 environments, one of which is the home, you have a better chance of achieving gains. And that's from straight child development research. So those of us in this field have to lean on that because we don't have the kind of longitudinal research that looks intentionally at the family engagement contribution that I think we need to have. And that's part of the challenge I think we need to be thinking about. At the same time, I think we are in a very different place now. And I look at James Heckman as sort of a bellwether. He wrote a paper 5 or 6 years ago about early childhood where he said in the first 2 paragraphs of his paper, we know that family engagement and parenting specifically is one of, if not the strongest predictor of what happens to kids. But since we don't have any evidence-based programs, we have to focus in on early childhood programs per se, and the more classroom without so much of the family emphasis. He did his presentation at the White House conference on early childhood last December, where he said the family is the greatest contributor to the success of all children and to upward social and economic mobility. And he used the Perry Preschool Project, Abecedarian, Head Start, and the Nurse Family Partnership as examples of evidence-based programs that tip him over the edge to say, we now need to start doing what he calls pre-distribution, which is building the resources, the family engagement, and the rest of it as part of our early childhood interventions. And he's used his time to focus a lot on that. So he's our bellwether. People are now paying attention to this. The question is then, what's going to be our perspective on and our definition of family engagement, and what are some of the things research has taught us about that? So in the space I'm in family engagement, I looked at all this stuff and I said, first of all, we've learned family engagement is a shared responsibility. When I look at it in schools, even in early childhood, well, it's the family's job to do X, it's the teacher's job to do X. No, it's a shared responsibility. And we've learned through practice and some evaluations that if you look at it through that framework, we're going to move farther than if we don't. And it's a shared responsibility across settings and across time. So we push on this new definition that says it's not a program, it's a process. That's what developmental research teaches us. So when we think about family engagement, we should be aiming toward collaboration across the institutions in a community that work with families, and including after-school programs, summer learning programs, all sending reinforcing messages about the importance of family engagement, and then continuous over time. I think part of the fade out is we don't sustain some of the family engagement we get in early childhood and build bridges to support that in the subsequent kindergarten and elementary years. So we've tried to use the evidence to reframe how we think about family engagement. And let me slip this one. So the next thing I look at, I decided I'm too stuck in my little space called family engagement. I need to get out of it. I need to look for analogies from other places that are not looking at family engagement as the silver bullet, but rather are looking at it as part of a mix of things, an ingredient in a mix of things, and adding value in that mix. So it's an intentional effort to integrate it in, and the evaluation of it is as family engagement as part of something bigger. Are most people here familiar with Tony Brike's work, the Consortium for Chicago School Reform, Libby? Yeah, so what Tony did, which it was asked the question, what is it in low poverty, in high poverty Chicago schools, elementary schools, that distinguishes the schools that had reasonably good literacy and math gains by 5th or 6th grade from those that didn't? He came up with this 5-ingredient model, and for those of us in the family engagement space, it has big implications for how we think about family engagement, not as siloed over here, but rather as interacting with a set of things. The school learning climate, professional capacity, leadership over here is the driver of this, instructional guidance, you can see these things. So family engagement interacting with these things then contributed to the outcomes. The pathway was that family and community engagement increased attendance so that the teacher didn't have to teach half the class that wasn't there yesterday, today, which improved instructional instruction, and that then was the pathway to better outcomes. I'm sure there were other pathways that could have been explored had better data on family and community engagement. But it's that kind of analysis, not family engagement alone, but integrated in with these other things to see is there value added and what are the pathways to the ways in which it interacts and adds value. So when we took on responsibility with the Brazelton Touchpoint Center at Children's Hospital in Boston, the new Head Start Family and Community Engagement Center, we did a lot of work to try to understand what Head Start was doing in this space with respect, genuine respect for their many years of efforts and a lot of good things, and said this is a place where we can begin to model what a next generation of family and community engagement might look like, and it can serve as a catalyst for thinking and for research. We made a deliberate effort based on Tony's model to try to build in systematic, integrated, and sustained family and community engagement within the model, to think about the pathways through which that family engagement interacted with other things to try to get to outcomes, and then to have a real commitment to performance management and to continuous improvement, to getting data about the family engagement on a regular basis within a program and at the national level to understand what was happening. This is the model. Some of you may have seen it. Then you can see the Tony's ancestry, or the ancestry of the model that he and his colleagues put together. The program foundations, program leadership, a commitment to continuous improvement, looking at data on a regular basis to see if you're doing what you think you're doing, from are the right parents coming in here to are we getting some of the kinds of gains we'd hope to get. And then commitment to professional development. The program impact areas, very much modeled on the kind of thing that Tony laid out. Then we pushed on what are going to be the outcomes that we're looking for. Improved family well-being, positive parent-child relationships, families as lifelong educators, learners, engagement in transitions, connections, kinds of things that you would expect to see, but then a real push to say that the centers need to operationalize things in those intentionally and be able to develop in their own logic model the ways in which they are doing those things. So my challenge to you guys, we've laid this out. Head Start's doing it. They just have led a new center. I think the challenge now is for independent evaluation that looks at, in a sophisticated way, the family and community engagement components of this as part of larger efforts to get better outcomes in Head Start. We need to start testing in a considered way defining what family engagement is, laying it out in the pathways, and then doing evaluations that test, are we getting what we hope we are from the family engagement piece of this? Many of you may have seen this chart. This is to get to another place, and that's to say part of the redefinition of family engagement is this notion of a cross-context. So this is a thing that one sees often now in debates about education equity. This 6,000 hour learning gap. And if you look at this, it contrasts the time that more advantaged and less advantaged parents put into and these kinds of things. I argue that you need family engagement, that's at the top of this, but families have a huge influence on obviously choices in preschool. We heard about that. How do they make those choices? They have an impact on whether or not kids, particularly in elementary school, go to after school and extracurricular activities. They have a big impact on summer learning opportunities, field trips, that kind of stuff. I'm indebted to Greg Duncan. He hasn't told you about this, but his work looking at the different amounts of money that more economically resourced and less economically resourced families spend on a number of these kinds of things has been very important in making the larger policy argument. We need to be paying attention not only to in-school or in early childhood classroom learning opportunities, but to broader ones in the broader community. So another thing that I've intentionally been doing is trying to get out of, again, this narrow frame that I feel like I'm sometimes stuck in. So I started looking at work by people like Mario Louis Small. Are people familiar with his work in this room? Mario Louis Small was at the University of Chicago. He's now at Harvard. He's a sociologist. He's one of the preeminent theorists of social networks. And he said in the social network work and human capital, social networks and human capital and social capital, we don't know the influence of institutions. So he decided to study New York City early childhood centers to look at the way in which early childhood centers as an organization built parents' social capital and networks, and thereby advanced theoretical conversations within network analysis and sociology, but also wrote a book I highly recommend people take a look at, because what he found was that these centers did connect parents, that the pre-K and the Head Start ones that had the mandate to provide parents with resources, information, a variety of kinds of things, were better at making some of those kinds of connections, that parents did connect and helped one another. And he linked what parents were doing to the Fragile Families study to make the case that this set of things that were generated by this set of connections among the parents, in fact, contributed to family well-being. He then said families can do, and his work showed, a lot for each other. So he worked with Acelero, purveyor of Head Start programs, to do a test of what he calls attendance buddies. And he's got a clinical trial going now. He said, I'm going to have 3 treatments, or no treatment and 2 treatments, and it's going to be matching parents to each other as attendance buddies to help each other make sure their kids were attending school. If my car breaks down, will you help my kid get there? And to hold each other accountable for doing it. And the results aren't in yet, but they're suggesting some real benefits in terms of increased attendance. So this is a way to harness the energy you have from parents and their capacities to help each other, a new perspective on this. The second one some of you may have looked at is work out of behavioral economics. This is by a particular gentleman who's at Harvard, who really is asking about the effects of scarcity, looking at neuroscience and bringing some of the behavioral economics work to bear, and looking at the way in which it narrows decisions. Economic scarcity narrows decisions, and then saying, okay, are there ways within that we can help people do what they want to do? Can we make it easier to do it? And I think, in a way, that's what Mario Louis Small has done by making it easier to get your kid to school. So the problem is not that I didn't do it, it's the context is not enabling me to do it. What I'm finding exciting about behavioral economics, and if anybody ever told me I'd be reading a lot of that, I would say you're crazy, but I am, is because people like Mario and Cindy are taking their stuff and putting it to the test in practice in the kinds of ways I just described. So I think we have a lot to learn from sociology, from behavioral economics around things to do within the family engagement space. I also want to say that I think we are in a good situation in terms of race to the top money. That money has been well spent to create an infrastructure for family engagement in a number of states that have prioritized it, Oregon, Maryland, Massachusetts, and a couple of others. And what they've done is create an infrastructure that embeds family engagement in their quality rating scales, in their professional development, and in a range of other ways that makes it a platform now onto which to begin to put good evidence-based practices to build out robust family engagement systems. They've also, in many cases, partnered with not the usual suspects, museums, libraries, recognizing we need to create a community commitment to family engagement and have many community institutions walking up to the table to try to create opportunities for that kind of authentic engagement of families around their kids' learning and development. Cambridge, Mass., simple idea here. Parent in Cambridge said at the transition to school, I also have to find after school for my kid, can you help me? That got the after-school community, the early childhood community, the schools, and the parent organizations doing a 4-page brochure on the transition to kindergarten, including the transition to after-school, how to find a good after-school program, the importance of after-school. So the transition became a time to say it's a chance to underscore, particularly for low-income parents, the importance of the non-school learning supports and accessing those things in that 6,000-hour thing that I just laid out. Kidsburg, Pittsburgh. For those of you that haven't seen what's going on in Pittsburgh in terms of digital media, this message from me is an example of the many ways in which they are connecting that community through maker spaces, through digital media, through incredible collaboration. We are not prepared, I think, to the extent we need to be for the digital revolution and the ways in which that can support family engagement. And Pittsburgh is a good example of a place that's doing that. So I think at this point, we also need to be thinking about the money and creating kind of a research agenda in this space. We need to address the underinvestment in family engagement research and evaluation, harvest the lessons from the past, and I've heard a lot of that here today. I would point to the paper by Lindsay Chase Lansdale and Brooke as a nice example of that. Invest strategically in knowledge development, and I'll show you some of what the Heising-Simon Foundation that's investing in this has done, and then fund and test more innovations. At this point, I need to say I've been in this a long time. One of the reasons I think we are as far as we are is because of people like Barbara Finberg at Carnegie that invested early in high scope and invested in the evaluation of high scope. People like Deanna Gombe at Packard who invested in home visitation and the clinical trials of the home visit models. So I think it's time to start trying to get more foundation, strategic philanthropic investment, if you will, to begin to build out and test some of these family engagement ideas. So Heising-Simon, this is a list of what they're doing. These are not killer expensive things. They're strategically chosen. So the first one is a random control study of the Avance program, which is a long-standing program for family and community engagement that operates in San Antonio, Texas. The parent texting study, this is really cool. It's high school kids, but they basically send the kids in a summer credit recovery programs. Parents got a once-a-week text from the program talking about their kids' attendance and a little bit about performance. And they did a RCT on this, and the kids of the parents who got those messages, in fact, attended and got the credit by the end of the summer. So it's a simple thing. It's a neat RCT. It says the power of that kind of messaging for parents. Again, give them something they can do. Get that message, ask your kid, did you go to the program or not that night, in the spirit of the kind of, create an environment where they can do what they would like to be able to do. Math study, the new study, Libby alluded to this, there's now a good RCT out of Washington, Flamboyant Foundation funded initiative to look at home visits, teacher home visits, that's proving some positive effects. Something on math, getting ready for school study. Another investment in the parent-child home program, long-standing program. They've invested to help them test some of the new ways they're doing digital media as part of that program. So my question is, why hasn't family engagement been an important resource and integrated component of early childhood programs and early childhood service systems? What's it going to take for them to become so? I think part of what's going to take is investments in looking at from a research and evaluation perspective, family engagement, seeing what we can do with that. And I think there is a willingness now, I see it in many states, to look at evidence-based practices, try them out, and to develop new ones, asking that they in turn be evaluated. So in the 60s, we didn't have the kind of infrastructure we have now, the understanding of the importance of the evidence-based programs. Now we do. That creates a platform, a demand, if you will, from us on the family engagement side to provide the information that is now very much needed. So thank you.